Well, welcome. The theme of the evening is no justice, no peace, or pretty much anything else that we want. Like, for example, we would like to have our environment properly dealt with and maintained or remediated if possible, and enough housing, affordable housing for people, and you name it. So I was privileged, not so much privileged, but I was introduced to the idea of the economics of Henry George early on in the 1970s, and I was called to it, and I think that's essentially how this. When I told people that this was happening here, I said, "Come if you are called to it." It's more than just a linear learning experience. It's really essentially a spiritual piece. It certainly was for me. And when I graduated from college and went to law school in San Francisco, I discovered metaphysics, which was really an important step forward for me in understanding. It's what I wanted to study. And then I discovered economics a bit later, and it really put the icing on the cake of my education and what I care about. So it grounded all of the ideals that I ever had, and the metaphysical piece of, well, we are eternal beings and we keep getting reincarnated here, and it goes on and on and on. How wonderful was that? I didn't know that growing up, but so it turns out maybe I was involved with the establishment of these ideas back in the late 19th century. Before anybody came, when this was announced, was anybody familiar with Henry George aside from the stuff that street corner ranting that I have done? So that's pretty amazing. But had anybody ever heard of Henry George really before? Yeah, who? And recently, one of our younger members of the of Bellevue Grange, heard me talking about this, and when I was talking with somebody at the Grange, and so, what are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about economic justice, and I said, you can find out about everything you really need to know online these days. It's plenty of information, and unfortunately, we don't have any videos of Henry George himself because he didn't live back into the 20th century. But there's lots of information, and you can even get the main work that he wrote that brought him world-class fame was called Progress and Poverty, and he wrote that in 1879, and that went on to become a bestseller. Second only in the time, several decades that he was around and talking about this stuff, the second only to the sales of the Bible, the Christian Bible. So people were very interested in this stuff that caught their attention, and particularly people in the West, uneducated farmers and workers and ordinary people who were not, by that time in America, struggling with, it doesn't seem like we were promised, kind of a democracy, and everybody was going to benefit from being in this country, and we've adopted free market economics, and it wasn't actually working. So what George proposed to answer in the book, Progress and Poverty, is how come there's so much poverty amid so much progress? Is that a question that if the first time you ever heard it in this lifetime, that's an important question to answer. And he answered it to my satisfaction. And so 50 years ago, 51 now, I was called to this and went down the rabbit hole and studied it, and well enough to be one of the few people on the West Coast, the left coast, to talk about it. And this was a surprise to me because I thought everybody would want to know about the answer to that question. How come it's not working for most people? So, and that was part of the education of what people aren't, I thought all I had to do was talk about it. That's all that happened for me. It's actually kind of simple in my experience, but apparently not for most people. And there's a whole lot of other psychological and emotional issues that get raised when we talk about these fundamental things about how the world works and how we make a living. So this thing from Chief Seattle, allegedly, I don't think he actually wrote this, but it's attributed to him, and I think it's a wonderful statement, expression of the Native American attitude toward the earth, the Mother Earth, and their relationship to it. And I think they were really surprised that here were these folks who came and invaded their territory, and they're kind of crazy. The constant thing I've read over the years is that the whites men would show up and they would ask, "Where are your women?" Well, they're not coming with us just yet. You just wait a while. And that the whites were kind of, Native folks looked into the eyes of the whites who came here, and there's something crazy about these people. And there certainly was, and still is, because we haven't really resolved this issue of the Native folks. It wasn't that they were always nice to each other. They would certainly defend their territory because having a safe place to be, that you could claim as your own, was truly important. Still is. Nothing has changed with that. But the ownership piece of it was completely foreign to them. So somebody suggested that I read this. I don't know that I can read all of it. Has anybody seen this before and read it?
Yeah.
So most people are familiar with this. The Native attitude toward nature and the land and all of that this is sacred and it's alive, and you don't just, what are you're buying and selling it as if it's just a commodity? They didn't even have that word. I don't know. I don't really want to read this whole thing. It'll take a long time. But how can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us, he was saying. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? Well, you certainly can if you're in this culture, in the culture that came from Europe into the New World, where there's plenty of land free for the taking. It turns out it wasn't vacant, that's for sure. Every part of the earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods. I can't read this. It brings me to tears. Thus we know all things are connected. Now, one of the things that people talk about these days is the unity of being and of the connectivity. The Native folks had this as part of their culture, and it was how they related to the land. They, not only were to each other, but to the earth and all the living things. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. But we will consider your offer. This was a response to an offer to buy a whole bunch of land from Chief Seattle's tribe by President Franklin Pierce in December of 1854. So this was the response. And he said, no, we're not, you can't do that. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for us to do that. That's what he was saying. Let me see here if I can really find something pithy here that I can hold in your mind the memory of the land as it is when you take it. Hold and preserve it for your children and love it as God loves us all. The Native folks knew that we were going to come on and take it. So if you're going to take it from us, then please love it. One thing we know, our God is the same God. This earth is precious to him, actually to the creator of all. Even the white man cannot be exempt from this the common destiny. We may be brothers after all. And of course we are, except that we don't quite understand their understanding, not yet. So we're on the track of it. So when I discovered the economics of George, it was this helped me understand absolutely what we had done. And I graduated in history from my mainstream fundamental education, and so I've always been interested in history, and this was the history of how this came to be, these ideas, and the answer to them. I think there's been an answer, clearly, that Henry George offered. So we come forward to today, and the idea is, and I've never heard anybody argue with no justice, no peace. Does everybody essentially think that that's correct? In order to have peace, we need to have justice? Has anybody ever heard anybody in the peace movement talk about justice? I have never. So I'm saying I'm the guy who, they're not talking about the kind of justice that I'm talking about. But the question is a really fundamental justice. So, and I think a lot of people think they have, or I'd love to talk with you more about that. I would like to know the specifics of that. Because generally, the people I've asked about who are in the peace movement, is there anybody who clearly is talking about economic, well, it's not just social justice, but it's economic justice. And I've never heard anybody say, yeah, for sure. There are plenty of people who talk about social justice and welfare and taking care of people in that way. And so my question is the kind of justice that most people, that what the government, what we do through our governments, is that the solution to poverty, and is that the kind of justice that would bring us peace? I guess if people think that it would or does, great. But does it, do you think?
No,
well, it's never been tried.
Well, so people, it's clear, it's kind of obvious without, why would you agree? Well, there's a feeling, a sense of it you have to have justice in order to proceed. Well, what kind of justice are we talking about? So the kind of economic justice that Henry George talked about for me was, wow, this is the answer to that. The kind of economic justice that that Marxism and socialism and communism has brought forward. I guess the question would be, they would say, well, this is the kind of justice that will bring peace. Do you think that would work? Has it been? It's been tried. The Russians for sure gave it a good long, several generation try. That apparently didn't work. So if we could have that discussion about that. So the idea is, you are here because here's somebody saying if we talk about what the fundamentals of economic justice, this might throw some light on the situation of why we don't have peace, or much of, why are we destroying the earth? Why are we harming each other? All of that. Why aren't we solving the housing problem when all that is a matter of building houses? So that's, certainly we have an economic system and a very robust construction industry that could build houses. I've seen that when I lived in Las Vegas for a while. It seemed like a house a day would go pop up in the outskirts of town. It was amazing. And that was right about the time that the whole so-called housing crash happened. So every third house was being foreclosed. But the point is, if you need more housing to house people, we could certainly build it. We know how to do that, but we're not doing it. So there's something, and I think the analysis that George brings to the table answers that question. Anybody? So if you have thoughts, we'll have a chance for questions and answers later. I suggest that if many people, after I hear me droning on about this subject, will go to sleep, it's okay. Or if you know, it's okay to go away, or you know, I'm probably not going to stop talking until my time's up here. But you know, other opportunities. I mean, if you catch me on the street corner ranting away, you tell me to stop, well, I'll stop after a while. But this is a much, you know, people if people want to, you know, here's an opportunity to discuss this, and anytime there's an opportunity like this, I've always been, you know, very happy to, because people do want to know about this, and only the people who've come at this point will want to. They're able and willing to listen, because without listening, this cannot go forward. Zoe.
Yes, so I just am ready to hear what is the viewpoint of Henry George, and why it was so relevant at his time, that his book was so popular.
Yeah.
And why it's relevant in this time today.
So the question that's being asked, for purposes of the video that is being taken and that will be posted at some point, is that why is George relevant now? Because he wrote well over 140 years ago. And despite the fact that he was a very influential guy as far as the progressive era in this country, virtually nobody's heard of him. That was the question I asked earlier. Anybody heard of him? Crickets. Nobody's heard of him. And I certainly had never heard of him before.
Well, not until you.
Yeah, aside from me.
I actually did hear about him. We were house sitting in a house, and we were watching a history of past American history, and he was prominent
In that.
on that discussion.
That's one person out of 20, 30 here.
75.
Yeah. So, the short answer to what George was saying, that would change everything. When I saw it, I think you may agree or may not, is that if we make the reason that there's this massive disparity of wealth between the folks at the bottom of the heap and the very wealthy, is that we have allowed, despite all the lip service we give to freedom and to the free enterprise system, we've allowed people to pocket huge amounts of what is known in economics. It's not. I don't think the economists use this term, but it's unearned income. And the definition of earned income is that you're the one you've created a good or a service. You've made something, or you provide a service, and you're creating the value that you're being paid for, either as labor, and if you're using tools, which is the proper definition of capital, is the tools of production, that those are earned incomes. But we mostly tax, for purposes of funding the community, mostly the taxes fall on earned incomes and very little, small percentage on unearned income. So what is unearned income? Anybody have aside from having heard me say what it is numerous times?
Money made with money, by investment, right? I mean, you didn't put out any necessary labor, you just used the wealth that you already had to generate more.
Yeah, that's not the answer to that question. I think that's many people think that that's just, if you've got money, then anything you receive back because of that is an unearned income. That's actually not correct in my opinion, in what George said, and so there's some distinctions to be made. And so maybe by the end of the evening, that you might get what I'm saying, because what do you mean the wealthy they're the greedy buggers that are screwing up our world? Well, yes and no. So that by the definition and discussion that George put out, it made crystal clear to me that not everybody with lots of money in their pocket in the bank were greedy exploiters. Most of them are. You can't make $1 billion without being an exploiter, of course, but the blanket, that the capitalists are bad and that capitalism is all screwed up and wrong, we need to get rid of it. There's a wonderful discussion to be had about it. So the definition of earned income is if you, with your labor, or if you have invested in a tool of production. By the way, this is one of those. Ever consider this to be capital? Every tool that you've ever used, that you're actually physically using, or all of the, if you're in the modern era, now we've got computers, and all of that is that if we're using that for the purpose of producing things or services, that's capital. So that's what anything other than, well, a lot of people think that a whole bunch of other stuff is capital, and it may not be. So here's a quick question here.
Yeah, just what about intellectual property and creativity?
Well, then there's an argument to be made that if you've created something, that you should have the right to profit from it. And, if it's like sowing the seed and, that you get, so that can be a wonderful discussion. Is that, do we give you a patent for that forever? Historically, we've given a certain, maybe 17 years was originally it's been, so we can, that's not the main discussion that George brought up. So yeah, some of that, yes, it should be, this is a product of your labor. And if you...
But not labor. I mean, that's the whole, and this sets up Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged and the whole Ayn Rand debacle. But, the famous apocryphal story about the guy who walked into Coca-Cola and said, bottle it. Or when Sean, I forget his last name, from Napster said to Mark Zuckerberg, drop the from the Facebook and just call it Facebook. What is that worth? Or a song. Somebody composed the song Happy Birthday.
So what would you, is it all private property that you should be able to exclude everybody out?
Different question, but you were asking what is capital, and I think that's part of what is capital. And the other question I have is, what about access? So if I own, supposedly, starting at a place in history, if we say I own this piece of land, and on this piece of land is a spring, or if I own the coast, and on the other side of what I own is the ocean, do you have a right to access the ocean across my land?
Good question.
And can I charge you? Or if I have a boat, and there's a river, and you need to get across the river, that boat is capital.
Way too many particular details that I could spend an hour. So the larger question, the Georgism analysis, what came from the point of view of, he was considered to be a political economist, which is, these are the fundamental principles of economics. So we'll finally get to that kind of question down the line. So what George was saying is that things that people do, whatever you pocket is either you've earned it because you've worked in, or it's either a mental effort, or it's labor, physical labor, or using tools. And he was of the opinion that people who labor generally, the general rule is that labor earns its reward. So all of the income from labor is an earned income. We could get into the details of that. And that if you're the maker of capital tools, and you pocket an income from either selling, making the tools and selling them, or using the tools, that's also an earned income in general. So the Marxists say that capital never earns its reward, essentially. As I think what I'm hearing from the Marxists, the socialist communists, if you completely took all of that wealth, then there would be no injustice. There would be, I think. But there's one other factor of production. It's in anybody take an economic course in their education? The most fundamental thing that in the Economics 101 is there's 3 factors of production: land, labor, us, and capital, tools. Has anybody heard that piece of, when you looked at, okay, it's land, labor, capital. So labor clearly earns its reward. If you're using capital, tools, then you also earn, and you can produce more, the reward for that, however you receive it, is an earned income. But what George was pointing out was that ownership of land, because you do not create the land. Anybody here? I make shovels, and of course I have to have access to the raw materials, but the land, nobody ever made the land, the dirt, the place to be. Nor does but now we allow people to own it exclusively, right? Everybody understands that. Well, and I own a piece of land, and most everybody in the room, if you own a home, you own a piece, not only a home, which is a person-made, a human-made, man-made thing that has an economics of its own, and you own a piece of land. The owner of land, the ownership of land gives you a 100%. If you're just renting or selling the land, that income is wholly unearned. Does anybody?
If you bought it?
Even if you bought it.
Yeah, by definition.
And so what's the definition?
The one that you gave before, the earned income is the result of my labor.
And your effort and your
My
investment,
effort, right.
yeah, in capital tools.
But I'm still puzzled, because, okay, so Barry writes a book. It's a very nice book, by the way.
Thanks.
Lost Commandment, delightful reading, if you haven't read it.
Yeah. And he said,
But it's not, the value of that book is not the paper that it's printed on.
no, it's the idea. So
Right, and
he's
so
got an
in
idea, and
exactly
he needs
labor,
to.
He received inspiration.
So he's the guy who wrote the book or made the film or all of that.
Right.
This artwork that is
Yeah.
displayed here. That's the product of your labor and your effort, and that, when you do that, that's yours. You have a legitimate right to have that be yours. If somebody comes and takes it from you without your permission, then it's a theft, and we don't like that. We think that's, and we have essentially agree throughout history to, no, we don't. We will prevent that if we can.
Apple won a lawsuit against Samsung over rounded corners.
This is all. All of the stuff that is way off the point. I could talk about that, but what I want to can we agree that ownership of labor, the income from labor is an earned income, and that if you use tools like the chairs in this building, the building itself is capital. It's here for the purpose of providing a service that people will pay for, even if it's a nonprofit organization. Yeah, Barbara.
So, basically, is Henry George's kind of basic concept really in tune with Chief Seattle, that we can't own land because we didn't create it? And then we can't sell it because we didn't create it? I mean...
No, that I don't think so. So the question is that George's interpretation of an analysis of economics to answer the question why is there so much poverty amid such progress? It's related to it, and this for me, I don't think that means. I think the only way that makes sense for me I'm not a Native American person. Unfortunately, I'm separated from the earth and the natural environment as much as anybody else, and everybody is bewailing that we're separated. Yes, we are, and I think that this is a way to understanding this economics for me began to allow me to understand what my human relationship, appropriate relationship with the earth is and was. But everybody needs access to land. right? We are land animals. I mean, that doesn't answer the question. You know anybody that can live without access to land in some way?
Well, there are.
You don't have to own
seafarers.
it,
There are seafarers, but that's a
but,
quibble.
but that's a land-based, you have to have a land-based place to port. You could live out on the ocean, and maybe you could do
Right,
that. People do
can
that. But that doesn't negate the whole thing.
Right. Or the O'Neill cylinder people that want to go live on a space station.
Well, if you want to live and can get there without theft from everybody else, that's fine. I have a problem with that. But everybody needs access to land. And so the general idea that I think the native folks agree to is that the earth itself, the natural environment, it's a freely given gift to all of us. None of us produced it. Nobody's figured out how to create molecules and land and all that. It's a free gift of nature, of God, of the Creator. And it belongs to everybody equally. That's somewhere in the philosophical understanding of our relationship to the earth. Well, the earth is our common home. But what we do is we allow people to take it, usually kind of violently, but that's only the current, the modern era is about violent taking of earth and land. In the day of when the agricultural revolution took place, turned out instead of just walking around and hunting gathering, there was no concept of having to own anything because all we were doing is gathering what the nature provided. But if you needed a place to sow a crop, which turned out to be how we do in the modern era for thousands of years, you need to have a place where you can be assured that if you sow the crop, that you will be the one to reap it. This is called security, and you don't even need to own it, but you do need to have this is mine, because I'm the guy, I have the right to access to it to conduct my affairs to be productive. It doesn't really require ownership of anything, but it does require the community agreeing, well, this is yours. And if somebody comes on and harvests your crop, that's without your permission, that's a form of theft. So it turns out that ownership of land originally was a rule and a law in service to labor. It was a labor law.
Is that separate, like, from communities, that just like?
No,
Is that kind of like the mining law that says if you don't work the claim, you forfeit it?
that's a whole lot. You have great questions. Well, yeah. So what happened when the native folks they didn't own it, but they had and they managed the use of it. And in the days of long before the modern era, there were commons. And a lot of people have been persuaded recently that commons was a very bad idea. There's a tragedy of the commons. And got news for you, that wasn't. The commons in the communities that prior to the modern era, the commons were well managed by the community, the people who were using it. And everybody understood, well, we got to have some kind of equitable access to land, and so they would divide up. If you're farming, everybody gets a strip to farm, and maybe the next year it's another strip, but it was well managed. And in that era, I think it's not very well known that women, the female of the human species, had a very important role of managing the commons. They had a very important, well-recognized economic role. And the reason what that was about is the women, they were the ones to raise the children and to care for the home, and they were the ones who didn't go out to do the heavy labor. If you needed to have wood for building houses, however you did that, the men were sent out to do that, and the women stayed home to raise the children. And if there were animals, if you had cows or pigs, you would run them with your children, teach your children how to manage the animals. And so access to the forests were very important. And so the women and the children managed that part of it, and the women sent their men out to do the heavy labor. Well, appropriate. We had the strength to do that. And we were happy to have most of the women do the job of raising their children. But there was an active management of women in the management of the commons and of the opportunity to make a living here. You know, so when the commons were foreclosed or they were enclosed, anybody heard of the enclosure of the commons? The history of that?
Say more historically when that was?
Well, in the modern era, it was from within the last 1,000 years, starting in England that I know more about, but all over Europe, that the people said, well, gee, it turns out that the commons were the social safety net for everybody, whether you were wealthy or not, nobility or not. But when the land was privatized, when the commons were privatized, now that was done by the folks who had the power to enforce that, the governments, and so the land was privatized and giving the exclusive owners of land the right to exclude and evict everybody else. And so they did. And it was a disaster for the ordinary people, the commoners in England and in Europe. And so they didn't have any place to go. Well, if you get evicted, where do you go? Out on the street. And so the history of that is really a disastrous, unhappy part of our history. So ultimately people went to the cities because there was some kind of opportunity there to work, but it wasn't on land. It was various other things to be done. But the women weren't allowed to work in cities. The men could, if you could find a job, you could work, but women weren't allowed to do that. So what did the women do? They used to be active, and they could help the income for the family to raise the family. And if they couldn't actually work, what was left for them to do?
Birth the children.
Well, certainly, yeah.
That's work.
Good job. Yeah, really.
In the 18th and 19th century, they took in mending and washing.
You could do that at home, yeah. Was there anything else?
Piecework.
If you could do something without having to get permission from, the culture for you to go to downtown or to a factory, was there anything else that they would?
They did piecework that was paid for
Yeah.
very, very meagerly
Okay.
by the factory.
Was that adequate for most people, do you think?
Of course not.
What else did they have to sell?
Prostitution.
Their bodies.
Mm.
So, and the term proletariat is the definition of that is a person who provides children. Look it up. It's really interesting. So if the only thing the only really productive thing, as a woman, you produce children, and you are involved in the raising of them. But if you have no other way to make an income that's workable for you, then what's left? Well, you can sell your body. That's where not that didn't ever go on, but boy, oh boy, that was a nasty piece of business that came out of human beings, whole masses of people, the majority of people being excluded from the land that they used to be able to depend on. So George was saying, well, if you have a system where we have all this incredible technological progress. Progress is defined as we're able to produce more food, more clothing, more housing, more of everything. In the new technology now, we can have all this metal, we can have railroads and metal equipment that now we can produce 100 times more than we used to. And everybody thought, well, that'll settle the problem of poverty.
Doesn't settle the problem of greed.
Well, no, but we produce. We have more than enough.
Right.
We have more than enough, absolutely. Do we not? I mean, this is the name of a book that my friend Timothy Nobles has written, More Than Enough. So the question is, do we have more than enough overall? Money and resources and intelligence to do stuff. Does that solve the problem of poverty? Doesn't even, wow, isn't that interesting? So more, being able to produce more is not, it's not the answer. When I encountered that, I said, well, wow, that's why this culture of more is so stifling. It's so stultifying. It's not actually delivering what we thought it would. So how come that some people are amazingly rich, incredibly and grotesquely rich, and the vast majority of people at the bottom are not? I mean, they're kind of living hand to mouth still. And if it weren't for welfare or charity, what would you expect to see?
Distribution's the problem.
It is, but if we didn't have welfare or all that, what would life be here?
I'd like to share something for this discussion, and right at this point of what you're speaking to, this relates exactly to it.
You've got to be pretty concise here. You know, we can discuss this later too if it's.
I'll read just a short piece of it. It's a 2-page.
Please don't do that.
But I'll just read a short piece that addresses exactly what you were just speaking to.
Okay.
This question of why doesn't it solve poverty?
And I guess the question is, shall we take the time to hear this alternative? Probably an alternative to the Georgism.
No, this is a perspective that is what George was attempting to address. I'm not in alignment with this perspective. This is a perspective of the psychology behind the progress of society. Poverty is that state and condition in society where the individual has no surplus value in store, or in other words, no property or means of subsistence, but what is derived from the constant exercise of industry in the various occupations of life.
Yep.
Poverty is therefore a most necessary and indispensable ingredient in society, without which nations and communities could not exist in a state of civilization. It is the lot of man. It is the source of wealth, since without poverty, there could be no labor, there could be no riches, no refinement, no comfort, and no benefit to those who may be possessed of wealth.
Yes,
Inasmuch
I think the point is made. This clearly, that is a position of perhaps, okay.
Inasmuch as without a large proportion of poverty, surplus value could never be rendered productive in procuring either the conveniences or luxuries of life.
Thank you. And if that came from Marxism or socialism, fine. I think that's the position. I don't actually think that's...
It was the treatise, it was from Britain, 1806 or 1815.
Okay. So the question is, does that answer the question of why there's poverty? Okay, so we're done.
Well, if you're very wealthy, it might.
Exactly.
Well, it doesn't mean that we're doomed to, we're destined to, a very large percentage have to be poor. And it's never going to be set up so that we all benefit from increase of productivity, progress.
So Wendell, there is a way that Henry George's ideas have been applied to urban
Yes,
cities.
I will get to that, yes.
If that might help kind of frame that.
Absolutely. So the point is, actually directly to your issue of no surplus value. Is that right? Well, land, you have to, if you're going to be productive here, you got to have access to land. You have to pay for rent or pay the rent or you have to pay for access to it, to own it. Say what?
Leasing fee. Leasing fee.
Yes. And, or then if you have an opportunity to work, then you can receive a wage. In economics, that's the definition of labor. The return to labor is a wage. And if you have tools that allow you to be more productive, own capital, then you can, there's a larger income that can be a return to the use of capital. Capital as well, it's these very rich cats, and they own the factories, and the folks that around here and everywhere who mostly Native Americans, I mean but Mexican Americans, Latin Americans have the trucks with the trailers behind them full of tools for gardening and maintenance of, all of that stuff is capital. They're capitalists, by the way. And can we include them in that definition? Anybody uses tools to be productive, and if maybe you're not the one to do it, but maybe you saved your money to buy shovels or whatever. It's a lot. I guess it's more complicated than just me stating that. But labor earns its reward. Capital earns its reward if it's being used productively and you're not monopolizing capital. Land does not. It's been found that if now that everybody needs access to land after we stopped being the hunter-gatherers, we needed places to be productive and to live. And so now you had to have the right to be there. And some people found, well, if I can just grab some of this land, I can charge people rent and I don't have to work. And so it's an unearned income because the owners of land do not make it, they don't create the land, and they don't create its value either. So 1/3 of GNP is an unearned income to begin with. And there's some other sources of unearned income beside ownership of land. And then, so land, actually the definition of land is not just the dirt that we live on, the space, but the air, the water is land, properly defined. The electromagnetic spectrum that we now use for all kinds of radio and transmission of television and all of that is now owned. Now, if I could own the air and charge you 5 cents a breath, I would become very wealthy, right? But nobody's quite figured that out. But we have figured out how to grab land this is mine, and if you trespass on it, either call the police or I will get my buddies to kick you off. This is where warlordism is all. That's what that's all about. You have a question, Anya?
Well, Henry George lived at a time where there was already privatized land.
Yes.
So, what's the solution to that?
Well, so the question is, who creates land value that gives rise to rent? Well, if I buy a chair, or I pay somebody to rent, to paint my house or build my house, I see how that value is created. If I make chairs, I see how that value is created. I make them, and I use tools to do that, and that's an earned income.
Even if you hire somebody else to do it?
Yeah.
Isn't that Rousseau and Locke and the social contract?
Part of it. It actually comes from John Locke. Yeah. And so the justification for private ownership of land, because it was a hotly debated issue back in the 1600s, whenever that was. He said, well, if you mix your labor with land, you have the right, you can properly, not just legally, but properly and divinely and legitimately claim to own it, because you've mixed your.
It's the concept of undeveloped land.
Well, but there's a lot of undeveloped land that's owned by people who don't even live there. Right now. Well, even then. So the point is that because access to land is, it costs something. And so how would land go up in value? Because the demand for it went up?
Yes, scarcity.
Yeah, and if we would make more land, then we could, the demand for anything, the supply of which is fixed or cannot grow, the price of it that people are willing or have to pay is created that way. Individual owners do not create that value, except as an equal member of the entire 8 billion people who live on the earth. If there were 1 billion people, then land values would go way down. And so what happens when a massive amount of people left Europe to come to the New World? The labor market, the labor availability went way down. So the supply of labor went down, and the demand for land went way down. So what happened? If people needed labor, the wages of labor rose during that time, and the rent of land went down. Anybody know? I guess that's it. But it would have to. It was a very significant movement of people away from where they had been, and people came here because in order to have a life, you have to have land, and if you always have to pay the rent, then you are always a peasant. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, and here now, I think, if you can't afford to own it or inherit it, because for whatever reason, you can, the best you can hope for is that you will always be a peasant, that you'll always just have to work for a living and turn over a very large part of your earned income, your wages, to the landlord, who doesn't have to work. So George's answer to the question is, well, since the community, so the answer to the question is, where does land value come from? I create chairs and clothing and buildings because I as a labor, I do that using tools. Clearly that's not the case with land. I got to pay the same dollars to buy a chair as I do for access to land. So the answer to that question is that the community as a whole, because of the need for access to land, creates the value of land. Right? Anybody?
And what do you do with the unequal distribution of the land? What did George say about that?
Got you covered. Yes. So the point is that people have, why are people so incredibly wealthy? Because the really wealthy own, in that day it was clearly the case, they own they own the land. And who are the wealthy throughout history, even before before 1,000 years ago? It was always the landowners, right?
Kings and queens.
And then if you had somebody who was the biggest, toughest guy around, the biggest warlord who said, okay, you're going to have to bend the knee to me, and we'll create a feudal system. I need you to manage the people, so I'll let you be the feudal lord of the county or whatever that is, but you owe me the sovereign, because I'm the guy who owns the land, really. And if you argue with me, I've got people that will do you in, because because I've conquered the land and the territory, you have to pay me tribute. And so I got my buddies as a sovereign, to manage that whole system. And it was more or less a system. That wasn't a bad system, feudalism, because, and one of the things that is little understood is that if you are a feudal lord, you owe the king, the sovereign, feudal dues. And in those days, all of the trained military and all of the arms and the armor and the horses that were needed to do all of that were required to be paid for by the feudal lords. These were called these were feudal dues that were for the purpose of providing the military. And of course, the feudal lords would then have to recruit the peasants and the serfs on his land. It wasn't an egalitarian arrangement by any means, but it worked more or less, and it worked because what were the feudal lords paying the king in those days? From what source? And the source from the rent of land. There wasn't something else. There wasn't a whole lot of other business to be engaged in. There wasn't what we now know as money. It's called, you can call it financial capital, but it's a whole other category. So the war was paid for out of unearned income. And today, and fast forward, the feudal lords persuaded Parliament to pass laws to exempt them from having to pay these feudal dues anymore. And why would they do that? Well, I don't want to have to pay. I'm entitled to collect this rent and put it in my pocket. Now, one of the people said, I don't understand unearned income. Well, one of the clearest examples of unearned income that we know in this country, and probably everybody on the planet knows, is that in the days when chattel slavery was legal, the income that one received from ownership of slaves was 100% unearned. Okay, so that's what there's something really dicey about. Well, first of all, being allowed to kidnap people, to take people and make them work for you as slaves, and the rest of the community enforces that. Wow. On the other hand, so that means that we were considering in those days human beings as capital. They were the tools. And to buy a slave, to invest in a slave, was a capital investment in this country. And so then when Abraham Lincoln declared the abolition of slavery, immediately, overnight, he destroyed the value of slaves in this country was second only to the value of land. I said, well, that's interesting. And people, despite the fact that slavery was a nasty piece of business, they say, well, no, we're taking care of our slaves. You have a lot of literal heartbreak for slaves and all of that, but we're taking better care of them than look at this condition of people in Europe who can't work or they get old, and we don't let them starve. We take care of them. And when I first heard that argument in my history books, I thought, what an outrage. What an incredible lie that was. Turns out that was true. That, relatively speaking, that slave owners took care of their capital property like you would take care of a backhoe. Really valuable, expensive piece of equipment that you used. Turns out it happened to be another human being. It was a great investment if you could make that human being work. Blah, blah, blah. So the history of land ownership goes back thousands of years. It connects up with all of our past history. It's in our DNA. And the reason that people came here was that there was, if you wanted to get ahead, you had to have access to land. And that was all booked up, all taken up. So people came here really for the land because essentially it was a vast continent that was for free. And this guy, John Locke, said, well, if you mix your private ownership of land, exclusive ownership of land, not only is it yours for your use, but you can exclude everybody else, and we will back you up on that. With the sheriff, you can call in the sheriff or the police and all of that, and evict people. Didn't sit well with the English people that I know of. The history of, I don't know about much of the history in the rest of Europe, but you can imagine. Human beings used to have access to land as a commons. It was their social safety net. There was no government to pay them any welfare. So the idea is, because community needs a source of revenue to pay for the services that we provide, that we want community to provide, you have to pay for that. And just like individual human beings need a source of income to have a life, to feed themselves, to raise a family and educate their kids and all of that stuff, and to have any kind of a life beyond just pure subsistence. So what George was saying, well, this massive amount of, what was the term you used? It didn't look like there's anything left. There's no excess income. There's no excess value because it's all appropriately been taken up. So the landowners who don't have to work, many of them don't. You can be an absentee landowner, but they don't create that value. And what George pointed out is this is the excess value. That if because we as the community equally create that value, that if we would take that in our tax system and untax earned incomes and increase the tax up to 100% of the rental value of land every year, just think of it. So what would happen? The incentive for land grabbing and land speculating would forever be gone. I've always say, great, own all the land you want. Pay us the rent, whether you're using it or not. That was what he was saying. And instantly, if we...
That's property tax, right?
And we have the mechanism in place to do that. But so we inherited that mechanism from the Brits originally, and some of it from the French. Everybody, the governments, by the time the New World was settled, everybody understood, well, if you're going to have a government to provide services, you got to have some way to pay for those services. So the question is, if I'm the guy owning the land and receiving a massive amount of unearned income, I prefer that the burden of taxation to fall not on me if I can arrange for it, and I can because I'm the guy I'm the wealthy one, and I can talk to my, the parliament or the government. Not this happened everywhere, but if the wealthy have always controlled. So instead of the wealthy being required to pay out of their unearned income to pay back to community the value that community gives to their land, there's no injustice with that, not even a little bit. So I'm happy to have people have private ownership of land. It's your land, and you're the one that because your name is on the deed and we've got records of it, you have to pay the tax. So there's no reason to get rid of private ownership of land. I saw an article the other day that, private ownership of land makes no sense. Well, for the purpose of extracting unearned income, yeah, it's bad news. But if it makes perfect sense that if you own a piece of our land, of my planet, it's your planet, that you're the person I look to pay for the rental value of the land that you have. Now, if it's not very valuable, fine, you don't owe a lot. But if you own a lot downtown San Francisco or anywhere else, it's lots of value. The question is, if you want land to use it, that's great. If you want to buy land and real estate just for the purpose of waiting for its value to rise, speculate with it, well, that's something else. Yes, and then you had a question.
How does this apply to different cultures? What if I'm from, a culture who doesn't believe that you can own land or doesn't believe that that it's right to dig, minerals out of it,
Great.
to just take what it provides and migrate with the,
Then you have a separate government, and you take care of your community the way you do it. If that's the ethic, I don't know of anybody who does that, but the point is,
Well, the Native Americans did it.
not now.
Not, well.
Well, I mean that doesn't answer that doesn't answer the question. The question of the abuse of the earth we own the earth for the purpose of abusing it and collecting the unearned income that we can get from it. If we took that incentive away, you can own all the land and the resources you want, have at it. But you have to pay us the value, the rental value. And if you're actually doing something to earn an income on that land, you keep that. So that was the
basic, it's not ethics, but the basic criteria is just money? Like
No.
how to move?
No. This will never happen just because of money. Yeah,
Well,
It-
power, money,
yeah, so-
power through money,
so
or man.
in the modern era, in the old days before there was money, before we had a fully active monetary system, that you couldn't measure everything in money and do it that way. Now you can. Now everything that we do, you can measure in terms of money. So it's a really, if you own land and you are collecting a rent, because now we have a way to measure that, and the rent goes up or down, whatever it is, we want that. And so
We want, what,
we, the community, I'm saying, the land is ours. Its rent belongs to all of us equally. Now, I might own a piece of land, and if I'm required to turn the rental value of the land, I rented my home out here to folks who happened to be in the room for years. They paid me a land rent and they paid me a house rent. The house rent was earned, the land rent was not. And so going forward on this, the community needs a source of revenue to pay for all the services. By the way, folks, did you know that all the community services that the community provides, the streets, the lights, the sewer systems, the water systems, the police, the fire, every one of those services increases the value of land. Doesn't increase the value of buildings, but it does increase the value of land. And so who should be paying for those services? If I'm never going to be a renter, I don't have to own, but if I pay the rent for my home where I am, I'm paying a land rent and a building rent, so that I'm paying the appropriate amount of money to the owner of the thing that has to be maintained. That's an appropriate income to him. But the land rent piece of it should be the part that is paid to the community. So land ownership is important. We want you to, we'll pay you a couple of % of the land rent that you might be receiving. And we don't want the government to have to manage all of that. Governments are notoriously bad at managing stuff like that.
So I'm not sure, she asked a question about how do we balance out the unequal distribution of land. Did George have a way of addressing that? Do we have a way of limiting the amount of land that some people can own so that most of us don't have access to that land unless we pay them? So how do we get to own the land too? Unless it just turns out to be the wealthy that own it all. See, this is the unequal distribution
So
of land.
equality was never the promise of anything here. Equal opportunity was the promise. So this business is, well, we're not equal. Well, of course not.
Opportunity for who?
Everybody on a basis of equality.
Pay for it.
Yeah.
Those that can buy the land. So that's not an equal opportunity for all. This is what we're talking
No,
about.
Well, no, this answers that question. I think that you can own as much land as you possibly want, but you are then on the hook for paying the rent on said land. So it equalizes it immediately. You can go
No,
get a piece of
because-
land and
because
use
This
it.
is I'm not willing to allow this, because that could take over the whole evening.
I just want to ask.
So yeah, a good question. But equality is not the purpose. Do we have an opportunity? If you want to have a life here, you can have access to land, all of this, and you can have a job because we're not penalizing you for the kind of work that you do. We can go on with this discussion.
Well, the Alaska pipeline comes up, as well as this possibility of a oil company in Canada running down through the U.S. out through Oregon to get out to Coos Bay to send it off to Europe. This idea of, in Alaska, they actually, in some sort of way, and maybe you can look at that,
I can
sort
speak
of
to that.
addressed, that it's running across Alaska and everybody in Alaska gets to benefit from this pipeline that
Well,
runs across.
and it's not a pipeline.
Or
It's called the Alaska Permanent Fund. In 1986, when the federal government said, okay, you can form a state here, and we will give you all of the rights to own all of the, for purpose, because the states own this real estate. The government didn't want to do that. But they say, we'll give you all the oil lands that we've discovered here, and you can use this to fund yourself. So the government, I'm not sure of all the details of that, but the government of Alaska called in the oil companies, because the government doesn't know how to do this. So they said, great, come in and help us develop this resource well. And when you do that, for every barrel of oil, we're going to charge you a hefty tax. And that it was a very large amount of money that went, because there's lots of oil, lots of productivity there. That the oil companies had to pay to the state. That was put into a fund called the Permanent Fund, starting in 1985 or thereabouts, and that was then given out to equally, in equal shares, to everybody as a payment, every man, woman, and child who lived there. Now you had to qualify with that, is you couldn't just pop in and pop out. But so I think it started around $1,500 and went up from there per person. So a family of 4 times 1,500, that's quite a bit of money. That made the difference, according to what I've read, in having life be workable there, because the people were sharing the value of the oil, and they were not. The state wasn't expropriating all the income from the ownership of the oil, but they were taking a fair amount of the rental value of land. Mm-hmm. So, but wait a minute, I helped create that value. Everybody in the room. Well, I know I never got because I create the value. We all create equally the value of all the land and all the resources in the entire planet, because we all, want access to. We all make these things valuable. So the question I have is, when was the last time you got paid a rent check for your 700 however many billion people on the planet? It'd be an interesting.
Well, then.
But that's not what we're proposing. But.